The room shifted the moment he spoke. What began as an ordinary status meeting took a turn no one expected. People opened laptops for routine updates and prepared to leave quickly, yet the atmosphere tightened when the CEO interrupted the discussion. He leaned back, glanced at the clock on the wall, and delivered a sentence that broke the rhythm of the entire team. "If you can't handle this project, leave." The words felt final, as if he had already moved on from the consequences. He was not looking for clarity or support. He was looking for the quickest way out of accountability. He pushed his chair back and gathered his phone before anyone could answer. His wife was waiting for him in the lobby, and he behaved as if the meeting had already ended. No one around the table reacted. The analysts pretended to read their notes. The project manager stared at a spreadsheet without seeing anything. Years of experience allow you to recognize moments when leadership abandons responsibility. This was one of them. You had carried this project through every stage. You had handled contractors, managed client concerns, and resolved problems no one else noticed. You had been the silent anchor. Yet he dismissed your role as if it were optional. You knew better than to respond emotionally. You opened your notebook and wrote a single line that marked the beginning of a shift. Decision point confirmed. He stepped out of the room and walked toward the elevator with his wife. The door closed behind them. You stayed seated, fully aware that something significant had just changed. The project remained on the table, and every eye slowly turned toward you. When the door closed behind him, the room regained its air but not its balance. You remained seated for a moment, letting the silence settle before moving. There was no rush. There was no impulse to defend yourself or correct the impression he had left. You simply returned to the notes on the table and completed the summary of the meeting with the precision that had carried the project forward for so long. The junior analyst watched you with a mixture of confusion and relief. You thanked him for his input and allowed him to leave first. The gesture reassured him far more than any explanation could. You gathered your materials and walked back to your office with a clarity that surprised even you. This was not a moment for emotion. It was a moment for order. At your desk, you opened the folders that held the history of the work. Every approval, every revision, every concern raised along the way. You reviewed timelines and progress reports. You examined the unaddressed risks that had been flagged months earlier. You read through client feedback that had never reached the executive suite. Later that evening, you continued the task at home. You opened emails that traced the real story of the project. You reviewed drafts that carried your signature. You saved versions that demonstrated how decisions had been made and how often you had carried responsibilities that were never formally acknowledged. You knew that clarity required evidence. People over 50 understand that preparation is not noise. It is protection. You called no one. You alerted no one. You allowed the facts to settle into place. By the time you closed your laptop, the path ahead was already formed. The client reached out sooner than expected. They had sensed a change in the rhythm of communication, something subtle but undeniable. For years, they had relied on the steadiness of your reports and the calm structure you brought to complicated phases of the project. They did not follow internal conflicts. They followed results. When responses from the executive team became inconsistent, they requested a brief call to clarify the situation. You joined the meeting with the same composure you had carried since the beginning of the work. The client greeted you with the straightforward tone of people who value precision over performance. After a brief review of the current stage, they asked the question that had been building quietly behind the scenes. Who is now accountable? It was not a challenge. It was a request for stability. You answered by walking them through the actual structure of the project. You explained the responsibilities you had maintained. You outlined the areas that required technical continuity. You described the risks of altering leadership in the middle of a sensitive phase. You did not mention the sentence that ended the room. You did not comment on the decision that pushed the CEO toward the elevator. You focused on the work because that was the only language that mattered. There was a long pause afterward, the kind that reveals more than any speech. The client reviewed their notes, exchanged a quiet look among themselves, and came to a conclusion without dramatic statements. Their alignment was immediate. They valued consistency and they recognized where it lived. Experience does not force recognition. It attracts it by standing exactly where decisions must settle. The shift began without a single warning. Nothing dramatic appeared in the inbox. No urgent message from the board. No announcement from leadership. The first sign came from the finance team, who noticed a discrepancy between projected revenue and the updated figures generated by the forecasting software. A senior analyst reviewed the numbers twice, then brought them to her manager with a quiet sense of confusion. Something had moved, and it had moved far earlier than anyone expected. In another part of the building, the operations director opened a routine status report and found a change in the ownership column. The name assigned to the project had been replaced by a new entity that aligned with the contract provisions, but not with the current internal narrative. He forwarded the report to legal, assuming it was an error. Legal did not treat it as an error. They recognized the signatures and the clauses tied to them. The transition met every requirement. The documents were complete and valid. They requested a meeting with leadership to discuss the implications, though the conclusion was already written in the paperwork. The transfer had occurred smoothly, without conflict, because the framework had been prepared long before emotions entered the room. By midday, department heads compared notes and understood that the project had moved beyond their control. There was no uproar. There were quiet conversations behind closed doors. There were questions asked in careful tones. Real consequences do not arrive with applause or confrontation. They arrive through recalculations, budget shifts, and the sudden realization that the stability they dismissed has taken its rightful place elsewhere. The call arrived in the middle of a quiet afternoon. You were reviewing a spreadsheet when your phone lit up with his name. The timing alone revealed everything. He had already spoken to legal. He had already seen the revised forecasts. He had already sensed that the ground beneath him was shifting, not because of noise, but because of documentation. You answered with the same calm that defined your work. His voice carried none of the confidence he displayed during the meeting. There was no impatience, no quick interruption, no attempt to dominate the exchange. He began with a question wrapped in hesitation. What happened? He waited for clarity, hoping for an explanation that would restore the structure he had taken for granted. The silence between you lasted just long enough for him to understand that the dynamic had changed. You responded with precision. You did not revisit the tone he had used in the meeting. You did not speak about the impulse that led him to leave the room with his wife. You repeated the line he had given you, the line that shaped everything that followed. You told me to leave. The words were delivered evenly, without bitterness or triumph. They carried the weight of truth rather than emotion. He inhaled sharply, as if realizing for the first time that a simple sentence could carry consequences far beyond the moment he spoke it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was recognition. Experience teaches that clarity delivered calmly holds more power than any argument. The call ended shortly after, leaving the echo of a lesson he understood too late. The ripple effect began quietly and then spread through every department. Meetings appeared on calendars without clear agendas. Managers gathered in small rooms to review decisions that had seemed unquestionable only a week earlier. Each conversation tried to rebuild a sense of order, yet every attempt revealed how unsteady the structure had become. People who once spoke with certainty now used careful language, as if protecting themselves from their own previous confidence. Responsibility shifted from one group to another. Tasks that had been assigned with bold declarations were suddenly described as collaborative efforts. Employees who had stayed silent during the moment that altered the room now hinted that they had misunderstood the context. The story of the project changed shape with every retelling. What had been a clear directive became a clouded recollection shaped by convenience. Human resources organized sessions to discuss communication improvement. They drafted new guidelines that outlined expectations for leadership behavior. The documents were filled with strategic wording that avoided naming the true issue. They referenced growth and alignment. They repeated phrases about enhancing trust. Not one sentence acknowledged the impulse that disrupted the project. The mention of ego was carefully avoided. The fact that the CEO had walked out with his wife was treated as irrelevant, even though everyone remembered it clearly. Inside the company, people adapted quickly to the shifting landscape. They blamed timing. They blamed the market. They blamed everything except the choice that started the unraveling. You observed from a respectful distance, understanding that presence was unnecessary. Mature professionals recognize when silence offers more insight than participation. You simply watched as the organization tried to rebuild a narrative around a truth it was not ready to confront. In the days that followed, people whispered theories about your decision. Some assumed you had finally reached a limit. Others believed the pressure had become too heavy. A few imagined resentment building slowly over the course of the project. None of these ideas were accurate. The truth was much quieter. This moment was never about quitting. It was about recognizing a boundary that had been crossed without thought or respect. You understood that leadership requires more than authority. It requires accountability, especially when the stakes are high. You did not step away because your feelings were hurt. You stepped away because the structure had shifted into a place where your work could no longer be protected. When a leader dismisses the foundation that carries the weight of a project, the environment becomes unstable. Your response was not emotional. It was strategic. People over 50 know that longevity in any industry depends on choosing where to stand and where to step aside. The company tried to frame the change as a natural transition. They spoke about evolving needs and new directions. None of their explanations acknowledged the simple truth. The project had relied on consistency, and that consistency lived in the record of your actions, not in the voice that told you to leave. Experience does not compete for attention. It does not raise its hand or demand recognition. It supports the load quietly and reliably. When that support is removed or dismissed, structures reveal their weakness with surprising speed. Your choice did not create the collapse. It revealed it. And the clarity that followed marked the true meaning of this turning point. If you are over 50, this moment carries a truth you already understand but rarely speak aloud. Experience teaches a different rhythm. It shows you how people reveal themselves in moments of pressure. It reminds you that some instructions are not insults. They are information. When someone tells you to leave, pause before reacting. Listen with the clarity that comes from years of holding systems together. They might be offering a door they believe leads nowhere, unaware that it opens directly toward your next chapter. You do not need to debate your worth with someone who has not taken the time to learn it. You do not need to perform loyalty for leaders who treat stability as optional. You do not need to carry the weight of a structure that refuses to acknowledge the hands that built it. What you need is preparation. Quiet. Steady. Precise. Documentation is not a shield born from fear. It is a map that protects truth long after the noise fades. You have seen enough cycles to know that volume is not leadership. You have watched people confuse authority with insight. You have witnessed teams follow confident voices only to return later seeking the steadiness they once overlooked. This story is not about revenge. It is about alignment. It is about understanding that your value does not disappear because someone fails to recognize it in a single meeting. People who underestimate mature professionals often discover too late the cost of silence they once dismissed. The work speaks eventually. The records speak. The outcomes speak. And when the numbers move without you, the call usually comes after the damage starts.